Imagine this for a second. Officials getting ready for public protests. And their public comments range all the way from, urging peaceful assembly to making really explicit graphic threats of violence.
Yeah.
What does that huge range tell us about the tensions bubbling up when power meets public dissent?
It really throws that fundamental conflict into sharp focus, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You've got the constitutional right people have to protest on one side.
Right.
And then the government's perceived need for control, for keeping public order, especially when that dissent is aimed right at them.
Exactly. And in this deep dive, we're looking at source material that really shows us this exact spectrum. It captures some incredibly different official reactions to recent nationwide protests. We're focusing particularly on stuff around the No Kings movement and demonstrations against certain immigration enforcement actions.
Yeah, we've got excerpts here from a video transcript that basically pieces together clips of statements from different governors, the county sheriff, even the former president, each one laying out their strategy, their rhetoric, for dealing with expected protests.
So our mission today, it's really to unpack how these officials, and this is key, as the source material shows them talked about and prepared for these protests, what do their stated plans suggest about that often tricky balance between government power, public safety, and, protecting the right to peacefully protest?
We're going to pull out the key statements, the key actions that this source highlights. The goal is to help you quickly get a handle on the contrasting views, the intense dynamics they reveal, really cut through the noise to see the core messages.
And look, if getting different angles on complex issues like this quickly and efficiently sounds valuable to you, make sure you subscribe. That's honestly the best way to catch all our future deep dives where we break down the source material just like this. The link is right there in the description.
Okay, so let's get into how this source material actually frames the situation. Right off the bat, it presents this central idea. It asserts that certain officials, and it names names, like MAGA Republican governors and Donald Trump, were, and this is the source's word, terrified of peaceful protests.
Right, and the source's angle is that because they were supposedly terrified of peaceful gathering, these officials deliberately tried to escalate matters, maybe even provoke incidents.
Exactly. The source claims the goal was basically to engineer situations that would then justify using what the source calls fascist tactics and scare tactics.
So the idea presented is that the really strong, sometimes harsh reactions we're about to discuss weren't just about keeping order, but came from a place of fear about nonviolent dissent.
That's the source's interpretation, yeah. That they wanted to create a scenario where a forceful response would seem necessary.
What's interesting is how the source then contrasts this interpretation of official fear with its own description of the protests themselves. It says they were mostly peaceful.
It does. It gives examples like the people dancing and playing music at protests in Chicago and LA.
Yeah.
It highlights this sort of vibrant, non-confrontational vibe it saw in some places.
And it specifically mentions a peaceful immigration protest in Omaha, Nebraska. Notes there were drums, chants, people apparently saying, "No hate, no fear, immigrants are welcome here." So it paints this picture of energetic but non-violent expression.
Right, and then the source shifts gears to detail the official responses that it believes reflect this alleged fear or this attempt to provoke things.
Okay, so first up is Governor Henry McMaster of South Carolina. This is about the planned No Kings protests. The source highlights his message, which was, South Carolina's law enforcement will not tolerate lawless behavior associated with this weekend's nationwide planned protest, the No Kings protest. Have a nice weekend, !
And the source really zeroes in on the tone there. It asks, sort of rhetorically, who talks like that? Implying it sounded maybe less like a standard public safety message and more like a challenge or maybe a dismissal.
That have a nice weekend part feels tacked on, maybe.
A little jarring, perhaps. The source also points to security measures seen at the White House. It mentions fencing going up, signs warning fence jumpers will be prosecuted.
And what the source finds significant here, or claims is significant, is that this specific sign was supposedly recycled from the Lollapalooza Music Festival, apparently.
Yeah, and the source argues it wasn't just general security, but that it was put there specifically to stop anyone interrupting what the source calls Trump's dictator parade.
Okay. Moving south to Florida now, the source spends quite a bit of time on Governor Ron DeSantis' rhetoric, especially about protests blocking roads. And the source has a very strong interpretation here, saying his statements were, quote, encouraging people to drive their vehicles through protesters and kill them.
Oh, okay. That's a heavy interpretation. Let's look at the specific quotes the source uses to back that up. It quotes DeSantis talking about protecting drivers if their car gets surrounded by what he called a mob. He states they have a right to flee for their safety.
And here's the crucial part, according to the source. It quotes him saying that if a driver in that situation hits someone, that's their fault for impinging on you. The source also includes his comment that drivers shouldn't have to be a sitting duck.
Right. And the source adds his comments about handling protesters who block streets without permits. Quotes him saying you can't just interrupt traffic, and also that the inmates are not going to run the asylum. It mentions he was ready to bring in state law enforcement. So the source presents these quotes as the evidence for its interpretation of his stance as encouraging violence.
Got it. Okay, let's shift over to Texas. The source talks about actions by Governor Greg Abbott, reports he deployed a really large number of personnel, 5,000 Texas National Guard troops plus 2,000 state troopers.
And according to the source, Governor Abbott framed this huge deployment as just a precaution, because large crowds might gather.
But here's where the source points out a potential issue, a disconnect. It includes this claim from the San Antonio police chief, McManus, and the mayor, Nuremberg. They apparently said Governor Abbott didn't tell them the National Guard was being sent to their city before the troops actually showed up.
Ooh, okay. If that's accurate, that suggests a significant lack of coordination, or communication at least, with local authorities.
Definitely seems that way. But maybe the most striking examples of official language that this source presents come from Sheriff Ivey in Brevard County, Florida. The source frames his public speech as a direct, intentional threat aimed squarely at anti-Trump protesters.
Yeah, this part of the source material,
it
gets pretty intense. The language is very graphic, and the source presents it as a clear attempt to provoke or intimidate.
So what did he actually say, according to the source?
Well, the source quotes Sheriff Ivey saying if people resist orders, or block roads, or try to run from the police, they're going to jail. Tired because we are going to run you down and put you in jail.
Okay. Pretty direct. What about the scenario of protesters surrounding a car?
For that, the source quotes him giving this warning. In our county, you're most likely going to get run over and dragged across the street.
Wow. Okay. That's blunt.
It gets even more graphic. If someone were to spit on or hit a deputy, the source quotes him saying they're going to the hospital and in jail and most likely get bitten by one of our big, beautiful dogs that we have here.
Good grief.
And then the most extreme statement, as presented by the source, was for anyone throwing things like rocks or Molotov cocktails or pointing a gun at an officer. The quote is, "We will be notifying your family where to collect your remains at because we will kill you graveyard dead."
Graveyard dead, that's the point.
That's the quote the source provides. Graveyard dead. And the source uses these specific vivid quotes from Sheriff Ivey as Exhibit A for its claim that this was a deliberate strategy to escalate things, maybe even inspire violence from protesters, which would then justify a heavy-handed response.
And Donald Trump's statements are also brought into this frame by the source, right, as provocative rhetoric.
Yes. The source quotes his comment, "When they spit, we hit." Simple, direct.
And it includes his warning about anyone protesting his planned military parade. Said they'd be met with very big force or very heavy force.
Yeah, and the source points out this warning was aimed at any protester, not just violent ones.
The source also brings up Trump's comments about the National Guard in California, quotes him saying they'd stay indefinitely until there's no danger, and him calling protesters bad, sick people, claiming they were often paid people and just agitators.
Right, so this source basically bundles all these statements together. DeSantis on drivers, Abbott's troop movements, Ivey's really extreme threats, Trump's warnings, and presents them as evidence for its main idea that these officials were either scared of peaceful protests or were actively trying to stir things up for political gain.
But then the source offers a contrast, right? It highlights California Governor Gavin Newsom's response.
It does. And it quotes his message to protesters, which was simple. Be stubbornly peaceful.
Stubbornly peaceful. That phrase really does stand out against the language we just heard the source attribute to others, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's presented by the source as, leadership actively trying to lower the temperature, implicitly backing the idea of protecting nonviolent protest.
The source also gives some important background for why some of these protests were happening. It connects them to what it calls the Trump administration's aggressive immigration policy.
Yes, it goes into some detail about specific IC actions, immigration and customs enforcement, which the source claims caused real terror in communities. It mentioned agents going into strawberry fields, detaining parents, and reportedly leaving a 12-year-old child there alone.
That's horrifying if true. What else?
It talks about agents rushing caregivers, nannies in LA parks and separating them from the children they were watching. Also mentions children and families apparently being zip-tied at a courthouse, and migrants being detained after their hearings in Dallas so they couldn't leave even when their court business was done.
And there was something about a meat packing plant, too.
Yeah, in Omaha. Arrests there reportedly included family members of a supervisor, people who weren't the initial targets of the raid, according to the source.
Now, the source does include a counterpoint, right? Quote from the Homeland Security Secretary.
It does. It quotes Kristi Noem, identified as Homeland Security Secretary, in the source, saying these operations targeted criminals. But the source frames these specific dramatic examples as the really unsettling backdrop for some of the protests, especially the ones about immigration.
Okay, so pulling these threads together, the picture the source paints is one of mostly peaceful protests, some of them driven by genuine fear or distress about things like these ICE raids.
And then the response from officials, according to this source, splits dramatically. On one side, you get what the source sees as provocative, escalating language from figures like DeSantis, Abbott, Ivey, and Trump.
And on the other side, the source points to examples like Governor Newsom explicitly calling for peace. The source even throws in the claim that Trump's military parade itself was partly intended to provoke opponents, people who, in the source's telling of Trump's view, supposedly hate any display of patriotism or celebrating of the military.
There's also a legal dimension, the source noted, specific to California at that time. A court was expected to rule on whether the National Guard and Marines could even legally act as civil law enforcement during protests.
Which is particularly relevant, the source points out, because Trump had apparently sent the National Guard into California, even though Governor Newsom didn't want them there.
Right. It adds another layer to that whole state versus federal power dynamic playing out.
So why does digging into this specific source and its particular perspective matter to you listening right now?
Well, I think it forces you to really consider the real-world effect of such wildly different official statements, right? On public conversation, sure, but more importantly, on how people actually exercise their constitutional rights, like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly.
Yeah, how does the language leaders use, whether it's be peaceful or, you'll get run over, how does that shape the dynamic, the potential for conflict between protesters and authorities?
What are the potential consequences when leaders, at least as this source portrays them, seem to frame peaceful dissent as something that needs to be shut down forcefully or even provoked instead of seeing it as a protected right?
So this deep dive into the source material really shows us a snapshot of these incredibly contrasting approaches to handling public protest, from calls for calm all the way to these vivid threats. And the source interprets this, at least for some officials, as a deliberate strategy to escalate.
As you think about, the right to protest and the complicated job law enforcement has in those situations, maybe consider what the examples highlighted in this source suggest about the challenges we face. How does a society effectively keep public order while also protecting fundamental freedoms?
And maybe whose job is it to draw that line and keep it clear between peaceful dissent, even if it's really critical or inconvenient, and genuine threats that actually require intervention? The kind of rhetoric documented in this source, it really makes you think about that line, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It's a tough balance.
It is. Well, if you found value in this kind of focused, fact-based look at complex topics, really getting to the heart of what the source material is saying, then hitting that subscribe button is the best way to join us for more deep dives like this one. You'll find the link and more content right down there in the description.